The British government has announced major changes to the country's asylum policy in a bid to reduce illegal immigration that they say is tearing the country apart. Professor Daniel Ghezelbash is the director of the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales, and he joins us now from Sydney. Daniel Ghezelbash, welcome. So first of all, take us through the numbers of asylum seekers arriving in the UK each year and what happens with them now.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, Joe. So currently, in the last financial year, there were about 110,000 asylum applications in the UK, which was a bit of an increase on the previous year, by about 14%. And 37,000 of those arrived in small boats, and that seems to be the real kind of flashpoint in the contemporary debate that we're seeing. And so the way the system works now is that, firstly, while applicants are waiting to have their claims processed, if they can't support themselves, there's legal safeguards that mean they're entitled to various social benefits, including housing and weekly allowances. And then those who are found to be refugees are given 5-year visas, after which they can apply for permanent residency, which then provides them a pathway to citizenship.
And so what are the major changes proposed?
So I think the biggest and kind of most concerning proposal on the table is to make refugee protection temporary. So this would mean that rather than those 5-year visas, applicants would get a 2.5-year visa, and every 2.5 years they'd have to basically apply for asylum again and show that they were still at risk of being sent back. And they've also made the wait time for permanent residency much longer. So rather than 5 years, you'll be on those rolling temporary visas for 20 years before being able to apply for a permanent visa. And there's also proposals to erode that social safety net to make it easier to withdraw housing and weekly allowances that were previously guaranteed.
What effect do you think this will have on the numbers arriving, and what about in terms of the UK's obligations to humanitarian law?
Yeah, look, I think they are very unlikely to succeed in their stated objectives of reducing the numbers of people arriving. And I say this because we've had similar policies in Australia before with temporary protection, and the stated goal of the UK government here was to make the UK less attractive to those seeking refuge. But this is really based on this assumption that asylum seekers somehow shop around and choose a destination based on how generous or restrictive the policies are. But extensive research has shown that this just simply is not true, that refugees don't compare asylum systems before running for their lives. They seek safety in places where they have family, where they can speak the language, or where they have other ties that can help them rebuild their lives in safety. And in Australia, our use of temporary protection visas had no discernible impact on the number of asylum seekers travelling here by boat. And one of the other justifications the government has given is that it makes it easier to return refugees home when things become safer in the home country. And again, Australia's experience shows that actually very few, it's very difficult to return people on temporary visas. Even 2.5 years, which is the duration that the UK is proposing the visas would run for, is enough time for people to lay down roots, both social ties and family ties that raise serious ethical and also legal questions, barriers to their removal. And while they're unlikely to meet their stated goals, what I can say is that they will be incredibly harmful for refugees, and that was the experience we had here in Australia. So there's prolonged periods of waiting and uncertainty have been documented to show to result in serious psychological harm on refugees. And my colleagues have described this as a state of lethal hopelessness, given the psychological impacts and also the rates of documented self-harm and suicide.
Is the UK following Denmark's lead to an extent on this, and also with an eye to what's happening in the polls in the UK?
Yeah, so the stated inspiration is the Danish policies, which have been doing forms of temporary protection all the way back to 1992. And I think it's interesting that comparison is Denmark, because it's another centre-left party there, the Social Democrats, that have been responsible for administering that party in recent years and actually making it more restrictive. And I think there's a view among centre-left parties that the refugee issue is a political liability, and they have to introduce more and more restrictive measures to try and outflank conservative parties for electoral gain. But it's deeply, deeply troubling developments, because someone has to be out there leading the case for refugee protection, and both the moral and ethical case, but also executing the case for the extensive benefits that refugees and people seeking asylum bring to the country, both economic and social. But that space is increasingly being vacated by the major parties.
Australia's opposition is also revisiting immigration policy. We've heard that just in the last 24 hours or so from Susan Lee. Is this part of a bit of a global trend?
It is part of a global trend, but I think in Australia, you see the focus is now on immigration rather than refugee issues. And that's in part because the Labor Party has introduced more and more restrictive policies, some that which the coalition would have dreamt up themselves. And so the flashpoint in Australia, as a result, has become immigration. But it's actually much more dangerous electorally to run dog whistle politics around immigration, just given how much of the electorate comes from immigration backgrounds. And so I think the last election would have been a lesson for the coalition about what happens when you go out there with policies that alienate or have the potential to demonise migrant communities.
Okay, Daniel Ghezelbash, thanks so much for talking to us from Sydney.
Thanks so much.